Thank you. My name is Emmanuel Ametepe. I come from Ghana. Um, I followed your interview, and one of the aspects that I would like to know something small about your view on is you mentioned the example of Asia, how they made it. What is the main difference between the case of Asia and Africa?
Yeah, there are many differences, but let me focus on one or two, the most important ones. One big difference is free trade. Asia, the most successful countries in Asia, that is Japan and Korea and now China. Japan, Korea, and China never adopted the idea or the ideology of fully free trade, of open borders. Take the
Yeah.
example of Korea. Korea, for a very long time, had very high tariffs on automobiles, for example, something like 400% on imported automobiles, which meant that was really the crucial condition for Korea to build up its own automobile industry. And this is more or less what happened elsewhere. In Japan, it was the government. The government sponsored the adoption of technologies through its famous Ministry of Planning, which is against the doctrine of the market. And in China, we still have a government that is, it's an essence of a communist party. Yeah? Imagine. So the most successful country in the last 50 years is a country that's governed by a communist party. And obviously, these communists in China had very pragmatic ideas and were not ideologically infected by any free trade or super neoliberal ideas.
All right. Okay. Yeah. You mentioned one of the main problem of Africa from African aspect is the issue of self-confidence. You mentioned the word self-befugsein and competent sein.
Yeah.
What is the problem? Do you think that because of the engagement with the West, or because of the infection, the word infection, with the neoliberal system, it has affected the level of confidence in coming up with our own basis for development?
Yeah, that's exactly what I think. Well, most of the African elite, as the elite in many other regions of the world, has been educated in the West. The people are going to study economics, in particular in economics. They're studying economics in Harvard and other places where everywhere, nearly everywhere, the majority of the teaching is neoclassical, what we call neoclassical economics or neoliberal economics. And these people come home with strange ideas, namely that the idea that they can, so to say, put or implant the Western Northern model of the market economy into a country like Africa, and then in addition have free trade, and the free trade should be helpful for this development. This is in my view, this is fully wrong and will never work because take the ideology or theory of free trade, there is no such thing as an automatic role of what they call comparative advantage, where developing country could come into the Western market, so to say, by their natural advantages. Something like that does not exist. It's a funny theory if you look at the assumption that is you have to make this theory work. Then you will see that's totally unrealistic. So what is realistic is that African countries, other countries that are lagging behind, will lose out in each single market that they open against the West, and then they end up being totally dependent on transfers of the West, and they have to buy what the West is producing. And this is the wrong way. Your people are able to produce. Your people have ideas. Your people can do what is necessary for a good future, but they need the conditions to do that. I mentioned several times in the German interview the level of interest rates. The level of interest rates is seen in the Western world and the Northern world as the most crucial condition for a good investment climate. In Africa, nobody cares. As my experience, in Africa, nobody cares if the interest rate level is 20% in real terms. Well, people say, well, that's not important. Why? We have anyway so many structural problems and corruption and whatever. That's nonsense. If you have many structural problems and corruption and whatsoever, then you need a lower interest rate, not a higher than the West. You need a lower, because then the internal conditions are bad. So if the internal conditions are bad, you need lower interest rate, not higher interest rate than the West. So it just, the world is on its head. And you have to emancipate from this thinking, because this thinking is bad for you.
Okay. I mean, you just mentioned the issue of interest rates. My question is, I mean, mostly last time I also heard your argument on interest rate. Can we, in this case, blame only African leaders or the system? Because mostly the argument is because of high risk for the banks, for example.
Yeah.
And we also know that this high risk of getting their money back is dependent on the neoliberal system, where the price of natural resources is not constant. So mostly their argument is, because we don't know what will happen tomorrow, with a higher interest rate, we can recruit our money back.
You see, this is, I know that argument. I heard it in Africa many times. It's a funny argument. Imagine what it means. If you think back to the West or Northern countries, if you would have 20% real interest rate in Germany now, what would happen? Well, many firms would go bankrupt immediately. So the risk that you don't get your money back is rising dramatically with 20% real interest rates. Now we have real interest rates of 0 or even negative, so the risk is very low. So turn that around back to Africa, that is to say, you have to take the risk. If there is a risk, you have to take it. And if the banks do not do it, then the government should do it. I asked in Ghana, the people, the politicians at that time when I was there, I asked them, why don't you install then a government bank? Take a government, create a government, build a government bank, and the government bank would give loans for nothing. And if they fail, then they failed. So what? What's the problem? You see, and to overcome against this ideology, if it is risky, then lower the interest rate, not increase that, because that shows the people need lower interest rate, not higher.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. I mean, you first mentioned also the issue of capital that can be gotten internally if there's a necessary discipline, and also the issue of, bringing out our competence enough internally. Do you think that alone, especially in relation to Africa now, with a lot of external, problem and dependency on the outside world, even if a government is very disciplined, brings internal changes, is that possible?
Yeah, sure, it's possible. It has to be possible for the whole world. The whole world has developed and got capital from nowhere. You see, nobody gave capital to the world. So how could the world as such, the whole world develop? They created capital internally. And for that, you need, as I said, you need a competent government, you need a disciplined government, you need a reasonable government, but a government who has, where some important and responsible people have a clear idea about the process of development, of economic development, as I explained before, Schumpeterian development. And Schumpeterian development is always development where you pre-finance, you finance things with risk, sure, with risk. You finance them, but at low interest rates so that people can try out. People have to try out many things, and some of these things will be successful and some will fail. That's absolutely normal. If you look at the North, permanently, a lot of firms are failing. Nobody cares. Some are successful, and those should survive and will survive, and then you create income. By this process, you create income. And income is the basis for capital, for new capital, and then you can continue in this process. You don't need capital from nowhere. You can create it internally.
Your example, I think we have about 5 minutes. I would like Wolfgang to ask the last question, but before that, I mean, when the Asian example you gave Korea, Singapore, and the Asian tigers, we saw that, I mean, the Western countries or the powerful countries did allow them to take their own path. We know many countries in Africa today, because of the, I mean, economic interest, especially on the natural resources, I mean, external influence, sometimes we have good leaders who want to take this path internally, but we do not allow them from outside. I mean, the external influence.
Yeah, that's right. That's why I'm talking about the International Monetary Fund. The International Monetary Fund is our influence in Africa. We are dramatically influencing Africa through the International Monetary Fund and through the World Bank. And you have to get rid of that sooner or later. Better sooner than later. So how can you do that? By emancipating from these ideas, emancipating from the idea that you need the North capital. If you think, oh, I can only develop if I get capital from the North, then you're lost already. You see, look at Eastern Europe. You don't have to go far. Look at Eastern Europe. There are many countries, they are eagerly waiting for capital from outside to come to develop their countries. That's nonsense. If you're not able to do it yourself, then nobody will help you in the end. So this is the process of emancipation from the old ideas to better ideas. And then why should not the African Union, you have something like an African Union, you have a number of powerful countries of Africa, why should they not unite for a certain purpose, like the European Union did once, unite for the purpose of emancipating from the North and get rid of these people that are sitting in your capitals and telling your government what to do. But this is a process, as I said, of intellectual emancipation, but this has to be started. If you don't start it now, you will never get independent, really independent. You know what I mean? Really independent.
Yeah, I think last time one of the argument about the micro level, where we do a lot about on the micro level. If the macro level problem is not solved, we will still be there. Then I came up with the argument that the two need to be done parallel, because this emancipation starts from the head or from our thinking. Right. Before you can also think about what strategies do we need to change things at the macro level. So do you agree with me in that level?
I agree, yeah. Do both. Do it micro and macro, but don't forget macro. My point was just don't forget macro, because this is at the end crucial for the success.
I would like Wolfgang to ask the last question so that we finish.
China, the US has said now the Africans should decide between them and China. How do you see the cooperation of African countries with China and the development institutions China is now developing? Is it possible in cooperation with them to bring the emancipation forward?
Well, what the Chinese do, at least, before I really answer the question, what the Chinese do, at least, they are less dogmatic than the West. They are more pragmatic than the West. They're not imposing conditionality on whenever you get $1 or so, as the International Monetary Fund does. They are much more pragmatic. And so far, that is a better kind of cooperation, in my view, than the pure Western cooperation of the last centuries. But nevertheless, also with China, those who have the money, who have the power, want to influence things in the country. So be careful there also. Africa is able enough, has able people, has everything to find its own way. But what is lacking is the self-consciousness. That is lacking. That is today the main bottleneck, in my view. You have to go through that and find your own way. This way is available, it's thinkable, but you have to come up with your own views, and that is very important. And that is what Asia did at a certain point. Asia did not accept the neoliberal ideas because for many reasons, not because the people were so smart but for cultural reasons, for social reasons, I don't know. So, but Africa has to come up. It has such a long history of being influenced from the North and the West, so that it should really start to think new and think independently.
Some people forecast that many African countries soon can't pay back their debts, and that we will get in the same crisis as in the 80s, when the International Monetary Fund then pressed on them the restructural steps. Well, how do you see it?
Yeah, this debt problem, let's discuss it another time. It's a difficult problem, it has to be explained properly. But again, paying back debt under conditionality is very problematic, and countries should think hard whether they accept conditionality for 10 years to be able to pay back a certain debt. I do not favor default of governments, not at all. But again, if you know you have to know exactly what are the alternatives. How can I get my country into a dynamic development process so that paying back my debt is no problem? That is always the first question, and not the question, shall I ask for help to pay back my debt or at the Russian institutions.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much
for the interview.
You're welcome.
And then see you next time.
See you next time. Bye-bye.
Yeah.